Sergeant Emma Blake barked. "What is he doing up at the consoles?" The control room hummed with low engines and quiet breath. Rows of young trainees stood by the simulators, their screens alive with practice flights. In the far corner, beneath the emergency lights, an old man moved a mop across the tiles. Reginald Hargreaves was 82. He worked in silence, his motions neat, deliberate. The bucket rolled behind him with a soft rattle, water shifting to his rhythm. To most of them he was invisible, just another fixture in the hangar. Oliver Clark noticed first. The old man's hand brushed the base of the control panel, a valve tucked low, and turned it with a small twist that looked too exact. Not curious, not clumsy trained. A few trainees smirked. One whispered, "Shouldn't he be polishing brass somewhere?" Laughter flickered across the room, quick and unkind. Reginald did not react. His shoulders carried the kind of stillness that comes from years under command. Emma's boots struck the floor as she crossed over. Her tone stayed professional, but her eyes were hard. She told the group to focus on their tasks, and the laughter stopped at once. Reginald went on mopping, his head bent, his right wrist tracing a rhythm no one understood. Oliver could not look away. He had seen that motion before in a training video from decades ago. A pilot's hand, steady on a pressure valve, adjusting a system built for altitude and survival. The resemblance was uncanny. Reginald turned slightly. A glint caught the light at the edge of his jacket, a dull silver pin, half hidden under the cloth. Oliver blinked. It wasn't the kind issued to maintenance crews. It was a flight badge, the old B-series insignia, worn thin by time. The air in the room felt different now. Emma noticed the pause in Oliver's stance and glanced between them. Her expression softened for half a heartbeat, then closed again. She ordered another round of drills, her voice cutting the quiet like a metronome. Reginald hummed something faint while wringing his mop. It wasn't a song. It was cadence the kind pilots use when running checks, syllables against seconds. The pattern matched the motion of his hand. Oliver caught it, and a shiver ran through him. A warning light blinked on the central board. Nothing urgent, just a systems test misfire. No one moved. Then Reginald, slow but sure, reached forward and steadied the valve. The light dimmed. No words, just that same silent precision. Emma frowned. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but she stopped. The room held its breath. Oliver stood still, pulse drumming. When Reginald stepped back, he left no trace except the faint smell of oil and floor cleaner. Oliver's gaze followed the hand, the pin, the exactness of a life out of place, and for the first time, he wondered if the janitor had once been something else entirely. Sergeant Emma Blake moved on, but her words had loosened something in the room. Oliver Clark stayed where he was, hands clenched at his sides, eyes fixed on Reginald Hargreaves. The old man bent, folded the rag with careful fingers, and the badge at his jacket hem glinted again like a hidden wound. A trainee jeered. He should be in a museum. And the sound tried to stitch the room back to normal. The laugh landed thin. Emma answered with a look that shut the banter down, and the trainees returned to their consoles with the practiced speed of those who know when to be seen. Reginald kept moving, as if the mop were the only thing keeping his hands from remembering other instruments. His motion was precise, a little ritual. Oliver could not forget the way the wrist curved when it found that valve, as if muscle memory lived beneath the skin. After the session, the trainees filed out. Oliver lingered, pretending to check his log. He watched Reginald tuck the rag into his belt and pat the jacket pocket, a gesture careful enough to make Oliver step closer. There was a small, careful shine where the metal sat. Not brass, not a civilian token, but a flight badge with an old B-series mark. Oliver mouthed the letters to himself, B and series numbers that meant nothing to most. Everything to some. Emma spoke to the instructor, low and brisk. Words about procedure and cleaning schedules. No one said anything about the pin. The base had rules about uniform and rank, and Reginald wore neither. Yet he moved with a courtesy that suggested he had once stood where others now stood. That thought lodged like grit in Oliver's mouth. He followed Reginald out through the service door, pretending to toss his empty cup. The corridor smelled of oil and coffee. Reginald shuffled slow, not because he needed to, but because he wanted time to put his jacket straight. Oliver watched the pin flash where sunlight touched it, and he felt the pull to know more. At the gate, a mechanic called out, "Evening." "Reggie," and Reginald answered with a name that was soft and old-fashioned. Reggie, like someone else might call him on a different day. The familiarity surprised Oliver. He had imagined the old man as anonymous, a fixture, but others used a name that belonged to someone with history. Oliver asked a trainee about him. Casually, the trainee shrugged and said, "He used to be allowed in the control bay sometimes, back in the old days." Then he stopped. The words hung awkward, a tiny confession that suggested secrecy rather than scandal. That night, Oliver could not sleep. He turned the badge over in his head, the way it looked against Reginald's jacket, the economy of the old man's hand when it touched the valve. He kept thinking that a janitor did not wear a flight badge, and a janitor did not move like that unless he had been taught to. Before dawn, Oliver pulled on a jacket and walked the perimeter toward Reginald's street. He kept his distance, a shadow at the edge of lamplight, and watched the old man's house where a single window glowed. Reginald moved inside with the same slow, careful hands, and Oliver saw through the glass a stack of folders and a battered notebook on the table. Oliver pressed his palm to the cold fence and decided then, with a clarity that was almost cruel, that he would learn what was in that notebook. The question that had begun as curiosity hardened into something else. He would follow, and he would not let the old man vanish back into his routine without answers. Oliver followed at a distance, patient and careful. He kept to the lane shadows, every footfall measured, and watched the glow from Reginald's kitchen window like a slow signal. Reginald's house was small, the table cluttered with folded maps and a battered notebook. He moved with elastic slowness, a tin mug in one hand, the other smoothing a page as if tending a machine. Through the glass, Oliver saw the badge flash when Reginald reached for the book. The notebook lay open, scrawled with coordinates and a heading stamped B-52 Hanoi route, words that tightened Oliver's chest. He waited until the street quieted, then edged closer. A line caught his eye. Order confirmed. Civilian zone misread, the letters blunt and awful in their brevity. Oliver did not break the glass or call out. He watched Reginald trace a name in the margin and closed the book with a hand that had known too many closures. The gesture made the house seem older than the bricks. At dawn, Oliver returned with a torch and a resolve that pressed across his ribs. He slipped through the back gate while the world still held its breath and found the stacks of paper. The logbook warm from recent use. The logbook smelled of oil and paper. Oliver turned pages and read lists of missions, times, crew names, notes written small and steady. Some entries were plain duty, others bore a weight, shorthand that hinted at decisions made under pressure. He found the page that matched the heading and read a terse note. Volunteered replacement. The line suggested choice rather than coercion, and that small detail rearranged how Oliver felt about the man in the bay. A photograph fell from between pages, a crease down the middle, and faces dirt-smudged, but laughing. Oliver folded the picture in his palm and imagined the men in it, younger and certain. The plane behind them a promise that had turned brittle. He sat on an upturned crate and let the room settle. The notebook had given him a fact that demanded something of him, a judgment he had not asked for. He felt respect, and something like sorrow that sat beside it. Oliver closed the book carefully and slid it back where Reginald would find it. He left without taking the photograph, but he did not leave empty-handed. The knowledge pressed in his mouth like a stone, and he walked home thinking of valves and hands trained to save or to harm. When he reached the gate to the base, the day had already begun. Trainees moved like machinery, routine and bright, unaware of the ledger that now lurked in Oliver's head. He paused, the weight of what he had read folding him into the day. He pressed his thumb to the memory, as if to keep it from falling out. He thought of Emma's voice and the trainee's easy laughter. He chose silence for now. He would watch the base through the week, wait for the system test, and learn what it truly meant soon. Emma called the briefing. The trainees gathered with their folders and polite silence. Oliver sat near the back, notebook closed but heavy in his lap. He watched Reginald enter on a tidy arm, shoulders straight though his feet shuffled. Major Wright stood at the head of the room, a man with sharp shoulders and an older grievance in his eyes. He moved like someone used to being obeyed, and the room adjusted to his authority. Wright addressed procedure first. Clipped and formal. "We will run an inspection of ancillary access and backup valves," he said, and the words fell like a verdict. A murmur moved through the trainees, low and quick. Emma folded her hands and kept her face blank, but Oliver could see the flicker of something behind her eyes, a worry that had no official name. Reginald took a seat at the side, hands folded, the pin visible against his pocket. No one asked him to leave, not at first, but the feeling of a spotlight settled on his shoulders. Wright paused and looked at the log roster pinned to the wall. He tapped a name with the ruler, his finger stopping on an entry from years ago, and the sound of the ruler against the board was small and precise. "You knew him then," Wright said to Emma, not loud but certain. There was a history between them that the room could taste. Emma nodded and replied with the economy a sergeant learns. He was on duty. She did not add why he left, and the silence did the work of accusation. Wright's jaw tightened. "My brother was on one of those missions," he said. The sentence landed, and the room inhaled. It became personal in a second, not procedural. Oliver felt the air change. What he had found in the notebook shifted from curiosity to fact that could hurt people, and he heard his own breath as if it were a sound effect. A junior officer stood and asked for clarity on the inspection scope. Words careful and professional. Wright outlined the steps, hands moving like a conductor, checks and cross-checks, and a system test scheduled at the end of the week. Whispers started at the edges, trainees trading glances. The base had its own memory, and memory was beginning to name names. Reginald rose when the meeting broke, slow and deliberate. He did not flee the room. He walked straight out as if accepting a summons he had already expected. Outside, Oliver caught Wright alone by the stairwell and lingered. Wright saw him and did not soften. "You were following him," Wright said. The accusation was a quiet thing, but it hit. Oliver admitted he had been curious, nothing more. Wright fixed him with a look that tasted like consequence, and then he turned away. By evening, the inspection orders were official. Notices went up, and men in white coats checked schedules. The coming test would decide who carried the past. Harris called from the console. "Systems test now." The bay moved to order, trainees at stations, panels ticking. Major Wright nodded. Checks began like a metronome. A panel flashed amber, then red. A jolt that tightened the air. Alarms stayed polite, but attention narrowed. Emma stepped forward. Boots measured. "What is the status?" Harris tapped keys and said, "The backup feed is spiking." The test had become a real fault, and hands moved faster. Reginald stood by the doorway, hands empty, back straight. Oliver felt the logbook heavy in his head, and trainees looked to Wright for orders. But Wright hesitated. The valve on the secondary loop pinned hard, the gauge refusing to move. Harris worked fast, face furrowed, seconds stacking into tasks that the room counted. Reginald crossed the floor without asking, his wrist shaping the same exact twist Oliver had seen, small and surgical. The bay quieted as if it recognized a hand that had once been trusted. Wright said, "Hold position." But the command sounded brittle. Reginald's fingers read the sequence by touch, pressing valves in a pattern like a map. He found an old safeguard hidden beneath a panel, a device tucked into the machine by hand and time. The override clicked. The gauge eased. The feed steadied. Systems aligning again. The trainees watched the man who had been written off return competence to the room. They had mocked. They now watched in a silence that leaned toward respect, and a junior technician whispered, "Did he do that?" Wright looked at Reginald and said, "You knew what to do." The words held the weight of someone who understood skill and cost, not forgiveness. And Wright turned to Harris. "We log everything," he said, making procedure inevitable. Emma moved to secure the panel and call the checks. She folded the rag and handed it back with a quiet courtesy. "Do your paperwork," she said, practical and protective. Harris recorded the override and frowned at initials carved faintly into the metal, letters that matched Reginald's pin. He took a photograph for the report, his hand steady despite the surprise. The technical report would later call it an undocumented manual override and recommend review. Committees would meet and terms like liability would be used. But the human ledger was simpler. Oliver opened the logbook and wrote one line. Reginald Hargreaves, operator. That night, Reginald left the base with his rag and his pin, his step lighter, and not without ache. Oliver watched until the gate closed and then went home with the photograph of men who had once laughed together, folded at the back of his mind. He closed the book and left the photograph where it lay, faces laughing under a crease. He walked away with the quiet under his ribs, knowing the old man had held harm and repair in the same hands, and that knowledge would outlast any tidy verdict. He put the photograph in his locker and checked it sometimes, a private tether to a history that smelled of oil and tobacco. The image kept him honest, a reminder that experience carries both ruin and repair. Reginald Hargreaves walked out of that control room the same way he walked in quietly, carrying a past that no one thought to ask about. We never learn what happened over Hanoi, or why he chose to stay on that base for 40 years mopping floors. Perhaps some stories aren't meant to be fully told. Perhaps the weight of what we've done is something we carry alone, even when we're surrounded by people who could listen. If this story made you think, share it with someone who might need reminding that we rarely know the whole picture. And if you've ever misjudged someone or been misjudged yourself, I'd be interested to hear about it in the comments. Until next time, pay attention to the quiet ones. They're often carrying the most.